All right. After going and watching the total solar eclipse on April 8th, it sort of spiked my interest again and a little bit more curiosity in astronomy and the biblical calendar. I think we did a series of studies related to the calendar and different astronomical things such as eclipses and so forth about 10 years ago or so. So it's kind of fun to kind of relook over some of those old notes and compare them with other more recent research I've been doing and things like that. So, being that my mind is on it a lot and thinking about it, I thought it'd be a great idea to do several more studies related to the calendar. I don't know how many of these we'll do, maybe 2, 3, something like that. We'll see. But let's start out. Usually when people are doing anything related to the biblical calendar, Leviticus chapter 23 is kind of a basis for them to begin with. So we're going to go through this here, starting in verse 1. Leviticus 23, verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. Okay? Feasts, or in other words, holidays or holy days. Verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. So as we can see here, and everybody, most Christians understand this, the most basic part of the calendar is the 7-day cycle. You work 6 days, and the seventh day is a day of rest that mimics, even if you would, the creation account where God worked 6 days to create the heavens and the earth and rested on the seventh. And that cycle, I believe, repeats itself over and over and over again in a way that's unbroken. Are we currently still on the exact 7-day cycle? Well, I think that's something that we'd have to do some research and try to figure out. There's been times where days have been added to calendars and things like that. So the purpose of my study isn't to dwell on that aspect, but just for the fact that this is the foundation of a biblical calendar. Now, I believe, if my memory serves me correct, there were other civilizations in the past that have tried to do different weeks. Like weeks, I think it was Babylon back, it might have been Babylon. But anyways, some of these I think there have been times where ancient cultures have tried to do like a 10-day week. And they found out that the hard way that there wasn't more productivity and people were getting sicker and it just didn't work out. Okay. So 7 seems to work out perfectly for our human bodies. Just think about that. So this is, if you want to be in touch with God's creation and you want to be on his rhythm, we always find out if you break his laws or if you break his rhythms, you pay the price in one way or the other. Okay. And I believe it's the same with the Sabbath day. If you never take a day of rest, and in fact, there's studies that show this, people who don't take a rest every seventh day have health problems later on or early in life with their heart and different parts of their body breaking down because they never ceased from day-to-day work. All right, verse 4. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. Holy convocations, basically holy gatherings. The Sabbath, the Sabbath was a weekly holy convocation. But now we're going to get into some special holidays apart from the seventh-day Sabbath. Verse 5, in the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. Well, the big question is, and the big debate is, well, when does the first month begin? And do we use a lunar calendar or a solar calendar or a combination of both? Well, the modern day Jews today use a solely lunar calendar, which I believe is more accurate than what the Gregorian calendar that Christians are using today, because the Gregorian calendar is based only on the sun. It's only a solar calendar, and it basically totally discounts the moon. Whereas a lunisolar calendar takes into account both. And why I believe both should be used is because when we read the scripture last week, is Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. When God created the sun and the moon and the stars, he created them for our calendar. Okay, they were all to be used as for timekeeping. So I guess there's two big questions here. I forgot. The first question is, when does the first month of the year begin? And what defines a month? What defines a month? Okay. All right, I got a little graphic here, okay? So we see up here, what we use today is basically a solar calendar, but a solar year is approximately 365.242 days. So we have to add a leap year in, or a day every 4 years, and we call it a leap year. So the solar calendar doesn't even work out perfectly in keeping track with the sun, because the sun doesn't make its full revolution in precisely 365 days. There's an extra fourth of a day that it takes to reach the spring equinox. From spring equinox to spring equinox, there's a fourth of a day difference. And you can't add, I had this discussion with my son Joshua. He says, well, just add a fourth a day. I said, you can't add a fourth of a day. Am I embarrassing you, Joshua? He won't look at me now. You can't add 6 hours to a day because now the time's off. So when you're dealing with fractions with time, you can't split up whole parts, okay? So what we do today in the calendar that we use, we wait till those fourths add up to one whole day. So you got 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4, and that gives you a whole. And then what they say is, so after every 4 years, we add a day, and that keeps us in line with the sun. Because if we didn't add a leap year every 4 years, every 4 years we would drift a day behind in the calendar, and then after so many hundreds of years, you'd be celebrating Christmas, if you would, or it would be winter time in July. And that doesn't make any sense for timekeeping. You don't, certain months of the year, you want to keep them in line with the seasons, right? So we add a day every 4th year to the current calendar we have. But the problem with the current calendar we have, which, by the way, isn't like it was something that was always used. It was in the year 1582 that Pope Gregory decided, along with his, wise men or people that told him that this is the way it should be done, decided that we're going to go with this calendar that we have now. And if you look, you see the months. Month 1, January. Month 2, February. And you go on all the way down. I just labeled them. I didn't put the title of these months. But you can see January has 31 days. February has 28. March has 31. Well, February has 28 unless it's a leap year, then it's 29. But you just go 30, 31, 30, 31, 31, 30, 31, 30, 31. Okay? Now, the problem with this calendar, although it is pretty accurate and it does keep us in line with the seasons, but just simply adding a small, just one day every 4 years, it's pretty accurate. with the solar calendar. But one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't divide the months according to the moon. Okay? So it totally discounts the moon. In other words, you could be at any phase of the moon throughout these months, and it just doesn't matter what the moon's doing. But a lunar calendar or a lunar year goes from new moon to new moon. And as you can see here, it alternates between 20 months, alternate from 29 to 30, 29, 30, 29, 30. And that is because it takes the moon 29 and a half days to make its full circle or go through its full cycle. Okay. From going from a new moon all the way back to a new moon, it takes 29 and a half days. Well, you can't have a month with 29 and a half days, Joshua. All right. And he's not appreciating this too much. He's like, Dad, you just humiliated me on the live stream here. So instead of having 29 and a half days, which you got to deal with whole parts when you're dealing with months and or days. Otherwise, the whole cycle gets screwed up. And so 1 month would be 29 and 1 month would be 30. So you're splitting or you're just averaging it out, right? But the problem with the lunar calendar is it's 11 days short of the 365 approximately. Now, a lunar year isn't exactly 354. It's about 354 and a quarter days, sort of like the actual solar year, 365 and a quarter days. So I'm just rounding down. But they're 11 days different, right? So, whoops, getting ahead of myself here. So we know we can't just add 11 days every year because now you'd throw off the moon cycle, right? You wouldn't be, it would be all messed up. You'd be no different really than the Gregorian calendar that we're using now, where months aren't defined by anything other than calculation. Okay. What I think the beauty of the lunar month is it would be very easy if you were a farmer. It would be, or just a simple person out in the country or anybody living anywhere before there was all this technology and computers, a very simple way to keep track of larger segments of time. Okay. But not a year, but a larger segment of time. And you just look up and you'd see one new moon to the next. And then you would know, okay, that's a month. And then you could keep track of time easily like that. Okay. But not to mention, I will say this, we're not going to get into this too much today. We might explore it a little bit further. You might say, well, Pastor Ben, what does the moon matter? If you can calculate out months according to the solar calendar, then why worry about the moon? Well, I believe there are practical reasons why you would want the moon to be used as part of your calendar. Who's familiar with the Farmer's Almanac? Okay. Well, many farmers, not all farmers, but many farmers plant according to the cycles of the moon. If you know, and you'd say, well, why would that be? How would the moon have any effect on crops and farming? Well, have you ever watched how the moon affects oceans and tides? It pulls moisture towards it, right? So the moon has an effect on the water on the earth, and by the way, our bodies are made up of 70, 80, 90% or whatever it is, water. And so the moon does have a physical effect on the natural earth. Okay? So let's say you're planting crops, right? You're planting seeds and you don't have all this modern irrigation that we have today. You're not going out there and having to water it. And you're relying on planting that seed at the right time so that seed doesn't die, and then you got to plant a new seed. Well, we know that that seed has to get germinated, right? It has to get some moisture. Well, I believe it's I'm trying to remember if it was full. I think it's full moon and new moon. Regardless, the phase of the moon will determine whether there's going to be moisture being pulled up from the soil up towards the seeds. Okay, so when you're planting according to the lunar cycle, that's a very important thing, right? You want your seeds to have moisture. And if you're not paying attention to the moon, you're missing out on the times when the soil would either be moist or whether it would be drier. So and what were the Israelites, by the way, primarily? Were they people that sat behind desks and computers all day, like we do today? No, they were farmers. Okay, so that's I really believe, and I really believe that the original biblical calendar used the moon to separate the months because it's very practical. It's even practical. I think it's even practical for Passover because the new year would start at every new month. As you can see here, I have little circles here that are dark. That's just new moon to new moon every month. Starts a new month, okay? Now, Passover, the first month, after the first day of the year, which would be the first month, first day, you would count 14 days later. What would that bring you to? Well, the moon would be waxing all the way up until about day 14, and you'd have a full moon. And so I think the practical thing about the full moon, which would be interesting, when you got all of these people traveling to Passover, you have a natural light in the sky at Passover. If you're all sleeping in tents, because there's not a bunch of when everybody came to Jerusalem for that holy convocation, all the males, all the elders, and so forth, when they came there. There wasn't, there weren't modern day hotels everywhere in the land of Jerusalem. I know there were hotels, but not enough for this many people. So I'm sure, they were bringing their tents or whatever they had to sleep in. All right. So that's my little short argument on why I believe that the biblical months are lunar months. But we haven't discussed how you would deal with this 11 days dilemma here, okay? Well, anybody got a guess? Anybody want to guess how you do it? We add a leap day every 4 years for the Gregorian calendar. Otherwise, the seasons would slowly get off. What would we do, Joshua?
Leap month.
Yeah, you'd have to add a whole month at some point, right? Because you can't add a half a month, you can't add 10 or 11 days, so you're going to have to figure out some kind of a cycle that would align with the solar year, and you just have to add a 13th month to the year, okay? And some would say, well, I don't like the idea of adding 13th month and stuff like that, but it's interesting because whatever we see in the heavens usually is mirrored on the earth in some way.
Why don't you just do 1 day per month? If you have 11 days.
Are you able to go up there and move the moon? Make it longer? Make it...
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, you see, you can't. So, like, our kids in math, we're learning a lot of fractions, and they're learning that some things you can divide. Let's say, for instance, we have 11 people, and I say, half of you over here and half of you over there. And you say, well, Ben, we have 11 people. Cut Joshua in half. Put half of them over here and half over there. You can't cut Joshua in half, right? Because he's dead. Okay? The body doesn't work that way. So some things you can't divide into fractions, so you have to rely on cycles. Now, if I said every... well, add 11 more, then divide you in half. Could we do that? Yeah, because then we could go 22, and then I could have 11 people over here and 11 over there. So I'd have to wait till the next 11 could come in, then we'd say 11 over here, 11 over there. So with fractions, there are some things you can't divide up, right? And I think days obviously are one of those. You can't just add a part of a day, and you can't just add a part of a month without destroying the natural cycle. But you can, and the Jews do it today. They add a 13th month every 2 or 3 years, and it works out to where it keeps the solar year and the lunar years right in sync with each other, just by doing that. But what I'm saying is, what's interesting in the Bible, you do have instances where you had 12 of something that was the standard. 12 disciples, right? 12 apostles. And then all of a sudden, the Apostle Paul was added. And then you have 13. Or some say you got the 12 apostles and Jesus, so it would give you 13. But then you go to the 12 tribes, okay? There can only be 12 tribes of Israel. That's the way God had it set. We can't change that. But didn't God change that? Joseph became 2 tribes. Started out with 12. 12 tribes became 13 because Joseph got the double portion. So Joseph counted as 2. In other words, Ephraim and Manasseh were, They were adopted to be Jacob's literal sons by inheritance. Okay, by inheritance. So the inheritance went straight through those guys. So Joseph got a double portion. So it's fascinating when you see that. And last month, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but not last month. Last week, we went over these 70 eclipses that happen in cycles every 18 years. And I pointed out that there were 70 Israelites that went down to Egypt. And there were the tribes of Israel were broken up according, because the eclipse cycles had so many full and so many, I can't remember the exact numbers, so many total eclipses and so many partial. And that mirrored like Jacob's sons through 3 of his wives, and then the other one through the one, and so on. So you saw there was this mirroring effect. My point is, there's this mirroring effect of what takes place in heaven takes place on the earth. And even the pagans know this, and they have symbols where they draw, one of the most basic symbols is the 6-pointed star, right? They'll have a triangle like this, pointed upwards, and it'll be dark or light, and there'll be a triangle pointed downwards, and they'll have under there, what is above is below. And here's another, does God do that? Look at creation, study creation. How about the roots of a tree? Does it look like the tree, but underneath the ground? Right? What is below is above. Roots spread out like branches. So it's a principle that even the pagans know. And it's fascinating. That's why I think astronomy is fascinating, because it does mirror what's going on. And God even calls, if you're thinking, oh, Pastor Ben, that's a little bit weird. Well, how about when God said to Abraham, your seed shall be as numerous as the stars of heaven, right? Stars above, seed below, children, stars, okay? There's a correlation there. Over and over, you'll see that. The 12 tribes of Israel were represented by the 12 signs of the zodiac, star constellations, okay? And so on and so forth. Okay, so how do we do this then? Well, I think this works out pretty good, the way that the modern day Jews, and not all of them are of Judah, by the way, and I'm not saying they are, but I think the way that they're adding this month, it works out. It actually lines up with the solar calendar and keeps the seasons in sync. So every third year, so the leap years would be on a 19-year cycle. They call this the Metonic cycle. It's a cycle when the sun and the moon basically keep in alignment with each other. All right, as far as timekeeping is concerned. So every third on a lunar calendar, every third, 6th, 8th, 11th, I'll just do my little pointer here. Every third, 6th, 8th, so year 3, year 6, year 8, year 11, year 14, year 17, and year 19 would be those years that you would add an extra month. Okay, you would add a 13th month. And the pattern would be, if you're interested in this, it would be 3 every third year. So it would come, the 13th month would be added on a third year, a second year, a third, 2. So you go 3, 3, 2, 3, 3, 3, 2, and that pattern just repeats itself over and over and over again. Now, some people disagree with that, right? They say, well, it's really as simple as this, and I think this actually works out to be this way anyways. When you see the spring equinox, which is, I think it was March 19th this year, all you do is when the sun lines up, and people got different measuring devices, you got Stonehenge, anybody can do it. You can get a fixed point where once the seasons roll around and you see the sun, bam, go there, and it lines up with some object that you've placed there. And then you're looking at it from a certain angle, you'll see it. And then it starts going the other way, right? So the spring equinox, what they do is say, once the sun hits the spring equinox, when days are equal to night, then the next new moon, whether that's in 2 days or 28 days, is the first month of the year. Okay? And if we were to use that method of reckoning, which I think is interesting, the first day of the first month, or the New Year's Day, on the biblical calendar, would have been the eclipse that we just saw, the total solar eclipse on April 8th. So you count 14 days after that, and tomorrow, interestingly, tomorrow at evening begins the real Passover. Okay? Begins the real Passover. Now, I know many of us celebrated Resurrection Day, what was it, 2-3 weeks ago, right? But I think it's important to understand what the biblical calendar would be. Some people will go as far as, and I've done this in the past and maybe do it again, you just totally ignore, let's say, people call it Easter, but we know it's Passover or Resurrection Day. There's Easter is not in the Bible except for one time, and it was a mistranslation of the word Pascha in the Greek in the book of Acts. Is to actually, go by the correct days when we observe the feast. Let's say, so if we wanted to be in line with God's calendar, we would just ignore what everybody else is doing on Easter and start the biblical celebration of Passover tomorrow night. And a lot of people do that, or they'll pick the weekend that's closest, and so forth. Fascinating stuff. But there is another method. So you could use the spring equinox. You could use the cycle where you just calculate every 19 years. You know, it goes 3-3-2, 3-3-2. You see it here, right? This method is actually pretty cool. If you let's say you were really dumb, okay, and you you didn't know how to add, and cycles were too confusing for you. My wife's looking like she's confused, so maybe this is for her. She's like, what is all this 3-3-2, 19 cycles? Okay, well, we're going to simplify this, okay? If you were a farmer, how would you keep the lunar year in sync with the solar year, right? Because you don't want to fall behind 11 days every year. Well, there was a simple method that many people believe was used, and it was simply this. In Israel, when the barley was green, had green ears, and that was the first month of the biblical calendar is actually called Aviv or whatever, and it means green ears. And so that barley would be, the farmer would look out there. Once he sees there's his barley has green ears on it, okay, then they would say the next new moon that they saw was the first month of the year. And why would that matter? Well, because when Passover comes and all of the other feast days, as you're going to see as we get into these, and I won't talk as much about everything then, all of the feast days relied upon harvest time, okay? If the harvest times were off, the sacrifices that they were to offer, the meal offerings and all that, they wouldn't be able to offer them. They wouldn't be able to wave the first fruits of their sheave offering and things like that. So it was a very accurate and scientific way for them to measure the beginning of the year by simply looking at what the barley was doing, okay? Because the barley was predictable. So in other words, once you get to a certain point, it would work out to be about every 2 or 3 years anyways that you'd be adding that extra month. It could vary a little bit from this based off of weather patterns, whatever. But that would keep you in line with the solar year, and it would be really easy. The problem with that is a lot of people like predictability, right? Well, I want to know if there's a 13th month because I want to make my vacation plans or I want to make my business plans, and I got all these things. So this calendar doesn't work for me. And that's why we've gone away from these kinds of calendars, I think, because we are no longer mainly an agricultural people. So this calendar worked great for agriculture people who are in agriculture, people who lived simpler lives and didn't have to worry about, well, when is the 13th month going to be? I need to know that now because I got to plan everything out in detail. And they kind of went with God's flow, if you would, versus stressing out about all this other stuff. All right. And I got an example for that. Some would say, what biblical basis would they have for observing the barley to determine when the beginning of the year would be? Do you remember when Jesus told us how to discern the signs of the times? He gave us a parable. It was called the parable of the fig tree. Okay? And in that parable of the fig tree, he said, when you see that the branch is yet tender and bringeth forth leaves of the fig tree, you know that what? Summer is nigh. Okay? So that's just one example where Jesus says you can look at nature, the plants, and that will help you determine seasons or times. All right. Carrying on. Verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month in Leviticus chapter 23 is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat of unleavened bread. So we obviously see here that the Israelites had a calendar. It involved calculation. It involved observation for them to follow. God wanted them on this pattern, and it aligned again with the agricultural season. So the 15th day, that would be right around the day after the full moon. Verse 7, in the first day you shall have an holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. But you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is in holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when you be come into the land which I give unto you, and reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits. It's a bundle, right? Bundle of firstfruits of your harvest unto the priests. Now again, if your growing season was off, and if, let's say you only went by lunar months, you wouldn't be able to do this you couldn't, in other words, you could not use a purely lunar calendar like the Islamists do, like Islam does, where they don't go by the sun at all. It's just their month one will sometimes be in the summer, and then sometimes years later it'll be in the winter. Okay? But that wouldn't work with God's calendar because you wouldn't have any of the offerings at the right time and it'd be all messed up. So you know that there has to be, well, one would say, well, that only documents that we use the solar calendar, okay? Well, I'll give you that, but I believe that for practical reasons and other reasons, the moon had to have been used as well. In fact, in the Bible, when the Bible translators use the same word, kodesh, to mean moons or months. In other words, to them, moons equaled months or months equaled moons. They were interchangeable. All right. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, when you be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof. Okay, then we do the first fruits. Verse 11. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So God's calculating out a calendar here. And you shall offer that day when you wave the sheaf and he lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto the Lord. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deals of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire unto the Lord for a sweet savor, and the drink offering thereof shall be of wine, the 4th part of an hin. Those of you who have a companion Bible, there's a fascinating appendix on the different measurements, or a very helpful appendix on the different measurements of what a hin was compared to the various measurements we use today. Verse 14. Anybody, do you guys remember the number of that appendix?
I don't.
Okay.
77.
Failed. F for measurement classes. I'm just kidding. Well, we've used it a little bit. I can't remember what it is. It could have been 77. I'm just teasing. All right. And you shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that you have brought an offering unto your God, and it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. Now this is interesting. It says forever. Well, some make the argument that in the New Testament, it doesn't matter anymore, right? We're not held to any of these laws, any of these ordinances, and so forth. Which, obviously, we're not obligated to offer animal sacrifices anymore. Christ fulfilled those things. But in the New Testament, Passover was still kept. In fact, the Apostle Paul said that you were to keep Passover with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. But the days seem to be kept. Like I said, it appears as though, we know the calendar we use today wasn't used until the year 1582, or the Gregorian calendar. Before that, it was the, what was that calendar called? It's slipping my brain. Anybody know what that other calendar was called? I can't think of it. But all throughout history, different calendars have been used by different nations and different peoples. We haven't always been using this January, February, March, April, May. In fact, when you look at the calendar we use today, it's a pagan calendar. The names of our months are named after pagan gods. Okay? So, interesting, we have these pagan gods now governing our lives because they determine when the months are. The god of January and March, February, March, and all the way on. And another argument could be made from the book of Daniel. What was it? Daniel chapter, was it 7? Where it talks about the Antichrist or the people of the Antichrist changing the calendar, said they were that he would come and change times and laws. Interesting. Okay. Even if there are some differences that we are to do with the calendar today, in the eternity, we got verses in the eternity like Isaiah chapter 66, the very last verse of Isaiah chapter 66. It says that God's people will come to worship, or all people, all flesh shall come to worship me from Sabbath to Sabbath and from new moon to new moon. And by the way, that'll make an interesting topic for another time, is that you can even find evidence of this in the Old Testament, that there was a celebration at the beginning of each biblical month. They were called new moon days, when the Israelites got together and had feasts. And in fact, there's a biblical law concerning it as well. And you shall eat, and so on. And so he says, it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. Now, here is one thing to think about, though. I want to throw a little bit of a caveat in there. This would be forever for the nation of Israel living in that geographical location, right? Yeah, obviously, growing seasons are different in different areas. So there's that is something that we ought to consider as well. The other argument could be, in the eternity, you're not going to have some people celebrating Passover on this month and some on this month, because their harvest starts and their growing season starts and begins at a different time. But that's outside the scope of what I want to get into here today. But all right, verse 15. And you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf, of the wave offering, seven Sabbaths shall be complete. All right. So what is 7 Sabbaths? 7 weeks. How many days is that? 49. What are we coming to now? Anybody guess? Pentecost. Okay, the 50th day. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you shall number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. So there's our Pentecost days. Now, who thinks Pentecost wasn't a significant holiday for biblical Christianity? I don't think anybody would say it wasn't, right? The Holy Spirit came on that day, according to God's calendar. Verse 17. You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave leaves of 2/10 deals, and they shall be of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven. They are the first fruits unto the Lord. So if my memory serves me right, barley harvest would have happened on Passover. Your wheat harvest would be Pentecost. And these are interesting for those that study the book of Revelation and prophecies that have to do with the harvest of souls that are likened to crops. By the way, what is above is below. You got barley harvest during Passover. Wheat harvest would be on Pentecost. And then it was your grape harvest would be during the Feast of Tabernacles. Grapes, and I'm not sure if it was corn and other stuff. I'd have to look into that. But obviously, not everything was harvested at the same time. We know that anybody who gardens today or who's a farmer in America knows that there are different things that are ripe at different times. And why do I bring that up? Because Israel's calendar was developed around the harvest seasons, the planting and the harvest. Verse 19, then shall you sacrifice 1 kid of goats. Now I'm going to read through the rest of this rather fast, and I'm just going to make a couple quick points. Then shall you sacrifice 1 kid of goats for a sin offering, and 2 lambs of the first year for a sacrifice of peace offerings. And the priest shall wave them with the bread of the firstfruits for a wave offering before the Lord with 2 lambs. They shall be holy to the Lord for the priests. And you shall proclaim on the selfsame day that it may be an holy convocation unto you. You shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. And when you shall reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest, neither shalt thou gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and to the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Interesting there. An anti-greed law in place there. Don't, when you harvest, just get the main stuff and don't go back and try to get it all. Leave that for the poor guy that needs some food. What I think is beautiful about that was a natural, today we have welfare, right? We got this welfare system. That was a very natural way for people to, slavery was a natural way for people to come out of poverty or to deal with poverty in a positive way. Because they still had to gather that food. They still had to do some effort in going and getting that food. It wasn't just, sit on your lazy boy on your couch. I'll give you a free phone. I'll give you a satellite TV, and you just sit there, and I'll just send that money through your computer, and you can just sit there and do nothing. No, they had to actually go out, pick the corn, and do something if they were going to eat. Okay. Interesting. A lot of principles we can learn from these laws and apply them even to today. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, okay? I believe this would be your 7th moon. In the 1st day of the month shall you have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets and holy convocation. All right. 1st month and 7th month. You shall do no servile work therein, but you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, also in the 10th day of this 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be an holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord your God. Many people believe this day of atonement was this affliction was a mandatory fast day, or a day of repentance, a day of sorrow, not a celebration as like the other days. And you shall do no work in that same day, for it is a day of atonement, the day that your sins are covered over, to make an atonement for you before the Lord your God. For whatsoever soul it be that shall not be afflicted in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. Whoa, that was strict observance back then, man. If you didn't keep that day of atonement, you were cast out of the nation of Israel. Well, spiritually, think about this. If you don't accept the Lord Jesus Christ, are you among the people of God? Are your sins atoned for? They're not. You're cut off. And whatsoever soul it be that doeth any work in that same day, the same soul will I destroy from among his people. So even if somebody was caught doing work among there, God would destroy their soul on that day of atonement. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings, or in all your dwellings. And it shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls in the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even, from sunset to sunset shall you celebrate your Sabbath. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this month, of this 7th month, shall be the feast of the tabernacle for 7 days unto the Lord. Which again, I believe, starts at full moon. Interesting. That both Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles would be transpiring during that same lunar phase. 35, on the first day shall be an holy convocation, and you shall do no servile work therein. 7 days, it's a whole week, right? Whole week. You shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day shall be an holy convocation unto you, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. It is a solemn assembly, and you shall do no servile work therein. So I like to think of this Feast of Tabernacles as sort of like a, it's a 7-day celebration. Sort of like they're grilling out, they're getting together, they're fellowshipping. These are days that were a blessing to Israel. I know when we're reading it now and it says, you shall offer this sacrifice and that sacrifice, we start thinking, well, that doesn't sound any fun. But think of this. If we're someone who thinks that sacrifice is no fun, sacrifice shouldn't be a part of our ritual in our daily life at some degree, then the problem is probably with us, right? Because a sacrifice should be a joyful thing to do for the Lord. You read the book of Psalms, David and other psalmists, they took joy in these times of year and these times of sacrifice. These are the feasts of the Lord. Feasts, not a fasting. This would be, so feasting is celebrating, eating. I mean, just think about this. You just harvested all these crops. There's plenty of fresh food to eat. So this is a great time of year. To offering an offering made by fire unto the Lord, a burnt offering and a meat offering, a sacrifice, a drink offering, everything upon his day. Now check this out. Everything upon his day. Did God or did he not make a rhythm, a periodic rhythm that his people were to follow called a calendar? He did, right? And we still do it basically today, even though our calendar is all jacked up, this Gregorian calendar, pagan calendar, even though it's all jacked up, it still at least keeps 7-day cycles, so we're not completely out of sync with God's natural rhythms. But how many people actually live their life that way? I don't know. Do we live our lives perfectly according to God's rhythms? I don't think any of us does, right? There are challenging aspects of it, indeed, in this generation. But verse 38, beside the Sabbaths of the Lord, and beside your gifts, and beside all your vows, and beside all your free will offerings which you give unto the Lord, also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep a feast unto the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day shall be a Sabbath. Remember, Jesus went up into the Feast of Tabernacles, so he observed it. And you shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and the willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And you shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year. So we know there were years kept, obviously, right? We know there are days, months, and years in God's calendar. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Okay, these booths were like tents, right? They were like temporary dwellings. And the Israelites during this time would make these booths made of these branches, make tents or little dwellings, little huts, and they would live in those for, 7 days here, approximately a week. And, they'd have a great time of fellowship, being able to be among the people of God as they're all out there, on a field or wherever they were at, on a mountain, dwelling in these booths. And you shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that the Israelites born shall dwell in booths. That your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths or in tents, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now think about this. He wanted the Israelites to remember that as they traveled in the wilderness, they didn't have a permanent dwelling, right? He wanted them to remember that the Exodus and that great deliverance and how they dwelt in tents. And you can remember even before the temple the tabernacle was a portable temple, if you would. Everything was portable. Verse 44, and Moses declared unto the children of Israel the feasts of the Lord. All right. So looking back, like I said, we went to that chapter because it really does give us a solid outline. Now, it doesn't give us every detail, and it doesn't answer every question we have as far as the calendar is concerned, because it doesn't actually go through the 12th month, right? It only goes up to month 7. But we know that there are obviously 12 or 13 months in a year because of the growing season. You couldn't repeat 7 months over and over again because the barley wouldn't be there and the harvest wouldn't be there and so forth. There's a whole nother explanation as to why that calendar God only gives the calendar from month 1 through month 7. But like I said, that would be a whole nother study for another time. The most simple answer I can give you, that is that calendar that he gave was both the holiday calendar and the agriculture calendar. In other words, that was the growing season, those 7 months. 7 months of growing, 5 months of non-growing, if you would, or so you got 7 and 5 there. So that gives us a good foundation, but I think there are obviously some very interesting things, because you get to the book of Revelation and Daniel, and you find that God does give prophecies in those books about this 7-year period. He calls it the 77s, 70 weeks of years. But that final 7 years that everybody talks about is about the time of the Antichrist, that's divided into 2 parts, 3.5 years plus 3.5 years, is given to us in Revelation and Daniel in 3 different ways. It's given to us in days, it's given to us in months, and it's given to us in years. And the days that they give us are 1,260 days. The months are 42 months, and the years are time times and a half a time. But the one thing that a Bible student will realize right away is they'll say, hey, wait a minute. 1,260 days isn't exactly 3.5 of our current solar years. And 42 months doesn't actually equal the same amount as our months do today. So, and then what you soon find out is that these prophetic times are based off of a 360-day year, And the big question then becomes why? Why is it 360 days? All right. And why isn't it 365 and why is it not 354? And so there's somewhat of a mystery there that I think is fascinating, and that in part that's what drives me to chasing these eclipse cycles, these calendars and stuff that my wife thinks I'm crazy. She says, can we get on to another topic? But there's something profound there that in-depth scholars have wondered about for many years. And as you go through the process of trying to figure it out, you learn many, many things along the way. And so I do think it's worth our time. It is something that God wants his people to know. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in the Bible. Okay. So we will be right back with questions and comments. Be sure to join us live every Thursday morning, 9:30 a.m. for prophecy updates and Sunday mornings, 10:30 a.m. for our line-by-line Bible studies. If you live near Princeton, Minnesota and would like to join us in person for our Sunday morning church services, please email me at ben@christianovercomers.com for details and directions. Also, be sure to visit our website at christianovercomers.com to sign up for our weekly email updates, find our latest prophecy updates on video or podcast, catch up with our line-by-line studies, also available on video or audio podcast. And we even archive all of our studies by date. So if you have a phone or a tablet, bookmark this page so you can play our studies on the go while you're driving, going for a run, or doing chores. Now to our questions and comments. Pull it's on. Why don't you ask that question? It's a good one.
Is it on?
If the light's on, it's on.
Okay, my question was just, I had a coworker once ask about, whether we see the full moon or it's a new moon or it's a half moon. It's always there.
Yeah.
It's just whether it's the reflection, the sun and how much of it's being reflected to us.
Right.
So how can there be a difference in how it affects us, whether it's full or new moon or half moon, when that's only the reflection of what we're seeing, but it's always there?
Right. That's a really good question. I was actually just listening to something about that last night. And then this all goes into whether or not some people believe in a geocentric model where the earth is the center of the universe and everything moves around it, right? And then there's the heliocentric model, which most people subscribe to today. I'm pretty open to either or. I do know from Earth's perspective, what we look at is the earth is the center, us standing here on earth. But so let's just go back to the moon. If the moon is circling around the earth, right? And it would depend on the angle of the moon and the sun. That would all depend on that as to how much it's illuminated. But what I think is interesting is even during like a crescent moon or whatever, you still see the dark side of the moon. You still see it because there's enough light reflecting off of it where you see it. But how that scientifically affects the gravitational, the tides on the earth and all that, I think there's a bunch of different theories on it. It's all based off of the gravitational pulls of the sun and the moon and their orbits and our orbits. So I guess the simple question is I don't know the scientific answer as to why, but we do know that it happens based off of however much, based off of the phase of the moon where it's at. I believe it was new moon and full moon both affect, they pull the water up in the tides. What I think is fascinating from a spiritual perspective, the moon is always, in the parable of, that was, not the parable, it was like a parable, the dream that Joseph had, where the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were going to bow down to him. The sun and the moon represented the father, and the moon represented the mother. And a lot of people, and you see the same thing in Revelation 12, where you have the woman, she was illuminated with the sun, and she was standing on the moon, which I think is fascinating. She's standing on the moon. All the appointed feasts had to do with the location of the moon, or the phase of the moon. And here you have a sign in the book of Revelation with a woman standing on the moon. That's where you meet, right? When the moon hits its certain phase. Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles are on the full moon. I'm going back to the illumination of the moon here. What's fascinating about that, you can't look at the sun. I always like to look at nature and apply it spiritually because Jesus did it over and over again, right? You look at this nature, well, now you know this great spiritual truth. You can't look at the sun without your eyes being burnt. And everybody knows that with the solar eclipse, you got to wear the glasses, and they tell you not to look at the sun because it'll burn the retina of your eye. But you can look at the light of the sun reflected off the moon. Okay? And so a lot of people say that the moon, because the church is the many-member body of Christ, that the moon represents Jesus in that way, is that man could look upon Jesus and live because God limited that his full glory, that full light, but made himself in a form that he could look at. We can go out and see the light of the sun on the moon. The moon is a rock, right? It's rock. You could see it's not a light of its own, because when you see any of a partial phase of the moon, you see the dark side of the moon, right? You can get a telescope, you can look up there, you can see craters on there. It's some kind of a rock, right? And so it reflects that light. And I think it's also fascinating as a spiritual type, because we as Christians are not the light. We're not the real light of the world, right? But we reflect the light of God. We reflect his light in our life, and people can see that light. But you can't stare directly at God and live. And in many cases where, well, let's say the Apostle Paul, saw God, or it was, saw the Lord Jesus Christ in his supernatural form, right? And it was too much. It blinded him. And there are many other instances in the Bible where God, wherever he shows himself, the light is so overwhelming you can't look at it. I thought it was really cool, because watching that eclipse made me think of that. Even right after it became, it was going from, the solar eclipse was going from full totality to all of a sudden the light was to be lit up. That tiny bit of light was so bright, and I wanted to look at it, but then you knew you shouldn't. It was like, but I saw it for a second. It's just like, bam! It was such a clear, bright light, and you could only look at it for that fraction of a second. You had to look away. But did I answer any of your question, or I just ramble on? Gravitational forces, planetary motion. I don't know what other answer would be for that. They say that, it depends on where the moon is based off of the equator and stuff, and how much pull it has on the waters. Anybody else?
I don't know how are we as Christians today I shouldn't say we're representing the New Testament, but I mean the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, Jesus still followed all the feasts and followed all the Old Testament times and stuff, right?
Yeah, and to my knowledge, the early Christians did it as well, kept all the same calendar.
But we've fallen away from that in America, I think.
Right.
I feel bad, because I feel I don't know when these feasts are. Am I celebrating the Passover at the wrong time? I mean, is that like does Jesus want us to know all that, and when that took place, and when we should be doing it, and not when we're doing it? Because I'm doing it because I'm celebrating it at the time that America says you celebrate it.
Yeah.
So are we to, the more you get into the Bible, I guess, the more you understand that. So apparently I'm not into it enough to really follow the right way.
Well, if you think about this, Genesis 1 verse 14, God gave the sun and the moon and the stars for signs and for seasons. And the Sabbath existed before the laws of Moses, so to speak, came about. So it was always there. And so I think you look at it from a practical standpoint. Could you imagine if our nation just actually observed every seventh day as the Sabbath? Even if you just picked any day, you're not even picky about it actually being Saturday whatever. You just picked any day. what practical effects it would have, even if we picked Wednesday. And I'm not saying we should do this. The practical effects of that is we would be united. Our calendars would be in sync with one another, and we'd actually have time to rest. Because everybody's on a different calendar these days, nobody agrees that, hey, this is the day that people shouldn't be working. And so we don't have this great unity of fellowship on that day and rejuvenation. And so we're all disorganized. We're all over the place. Whereas I think if we all... So I don't think the New Testament negated the biblical calendar, because that's just like God's so orderly. Everything in his creation is orderly. That'd be like saying all these things that I got moving around designed for you to live your life by. Now that Jesus came, none of that matters anymore. Just everybody just decide for yourself. I don't think that's what the New Testament brought in. I do think that Jesus fulfilled many of the requirements on those days, like the literal sacrifices, So I think, long and short of it is, I think the early Christians did keep the feast days and the calendar the same, and then over time we just drifted away into this everybody's doing their own thing, or this pagan calendar that totally separates us. Well, think about this. Just for the fact that we don't use the moon as our calendar, that one step right there disassociates man from creation. It severs that connection, because now you're not even, what the heck's the moon? It's just an insignificant thing out there. Or what other stars? Nobody even cares what constellations are what. There's no connection with man on the earth to the heavens anymore. There's been a divide. And whereas if we were conscious of every month beginning at a new moon, that's why I think it's fascinating about the eclipse, because actually everybody's actually going out there and observing a natural planetary motion that God had set in place. And they don't hardly ever do that. Where we would be doing that every month, you'd be saying, oh, it's a new month today. All right, we're gonna do this, and that, or whatever, and everybody would just kind of be on the same thing and be connected with God's natural order. And the fear of that, when you start talking about the sun and the moon and the stars, people start thinking of witchcraft and stuff like that. I got news for you. The calendar we're using now is thoroughly pagan. So if you're afraid of looking at the moon for a month, but yet you're adhering religiously to the Gregorian calendar, you're committing the very act that you're accusing other people of doing when they want to divide their months by the moon, or pay attention to that stuff. So it's ridiculous. I think, like I said, if we started with the seventh-day Sabbath and then you worked into the feast days, all those things would bring unity among the nation. It would bring us in sync with God's natural order. And there are probably, and I'm not going to go into this too deep because someone would accuse me of getting the New Age stuff. I do think the moon has an effect on our energy level and our moods. And we know it does. We even have the case of the lunatic, right? Once a month, my wife goes crazy. Well, that's something else. Oh, that's something else. But hey, that's
9.5-day cycle.
I was just gonna say. Now check this out. I'd be able to predict when she's gonna go crazy if we use a lunar calendar, because her cycle goes on a 29.5-day cycle, and I can mark on my calendar: be careful, walk gently. But now I have no idea. Gonna have to start marking that in my daily journal. Oh, the moon was at this phase when she was acting strange. And then I'd have a heads up. All right. But no, like, for instance, I notice after learning this that when there is a full moon, my focus and my thinking, that my brain energy is enhanced. I feel like things. So from a practical standpoint, you could plan your biggest tasks on like a full moon day. I'm gonna spend 8 hours studying this topic today, and your brain's probably gonna work better for you because you're working in with the rhythm of God's creation versus another day where you should just be outside working physically because conditions should be right. Or planting the seed planting is the most basic one, right? For practical for farming, it goes based off of whether the moisture's up or whether it's down, based off of the cycle of the moon. But like I said, our bodies are made out of water too. So the moon, if the moon has an effect at pulling water, not only in the oceans and the lakes and the rivers and in the earth, it's pulling on the water in our bodies. So it's affecting us physically. So with that said, when God's making his feast days on certain days and he counts that, is there also a physical and or spiritual reason why he's doing that? I think there is. And, pagans use the moon calendar. They do use the moon calendar as well. There's some that just use the sun, but there are some branches that get really into your physical body, chakras, all this kind of stuff, where there's type of the science of your spiritual body and your physical body. And they observe closely lunar cycles. And it's not because those things are pagan. It's because I think they understand a little bit about nature. But the problem is they worship nature and worship themselves versus just saying, hey, I kind of want to be on God's calendar so that things work smoother for me and I'm happy, versus obsessing over it and trying to, make a God out of yourself somehow by aligning your spine with the moon or something like that, So you got to be careful. You don't want to get into paganism by trying to get away from paganism. By trying to get away from the Gregorian calendar, you don't want to get too, but it's creation. I think it's all natural. If every day, and I'll say this, if every day was the same, and none of these things mattered for us, then we could just go out and plant a seed of corn or watermelon or whatever, any day of the year, any day of the week, and it would always be the same. If it was just all mathematical calculation, just plant now. You know what I'm saying? So everything's in cycles. If plants can only be planted at certain times, then there's probably some things in our spiritual life that can only happen at certain times. Anything, did I elaborate enough on that?
Yeah, I was just I was talking about along with that is like Passover being, we don't really, according to God's calendar, we don't celebrate it then. Or Pentecost. Who even celebrates that?
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's other feasts that only the Jews know about or celebrate them. Why don't we as American Christians do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's three major feasts. It's Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles would be the three major ones. And then those are kind of divided up. Passover is like a week long, and so is the Feast of Tabernacles. But then there's the blowing of there's some other minor holy days in there too, like the blowing of trumpets on the first day of the 7th month.
Those were very important to God.
Well, think about how bad it's getting now. Now we have a day for anything and everything that is against the Bible. You got LGBT Day month, and there's a transgender. It's like they're making all of these holy days, world holy days, but nobody, like you're saying, nobody follows the actual holy days anymore.
Especially churches. Just because we're not of if we are of Jewish descent, but they still do it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Is that accompanied, or does that relate to Jesus? Because a lot of them don't believe in Jesus. Well, they believe of Jesus, but not the Messiah. But they still follow those feasts.
Yeah, for the most part. There's arguments on whether the calendar they use is completely accurate or not. But yeah, it does seem as a lot closer than what we're doing now. There was a point I was going to make, and it just slipped my brain because of these two walking around whispering.
There's a lot of like believers and stuff that are starting to like recognize that like they're not like just Jewish feasts, you know. Like he says,
Oh, yeah.
these are my feasts, you know. So there's a lot more believers that are waking up to that and getting back to like the scriptures, because that's what we're taught like all our lives. Or these are Jewish feasts, you know. These are just for the Jews, you know, rather than just no. He says these are my feasts, you know.
Well, and in the eternity, there's this is what I forgot. Now I'm bringing it up. In the eternity, it talks about the Feast of Tabernacles. God says it was either eternity or the millennial era. I can't remember, but it says any nation that does not come up to. This was in the book of Isaiah, I believe. Zechariah. Oh yeah, Zechariah. Any nation that does not come up to worship me on the Feast of Tabernacles. Now this is yet in the future. Will be destroyed. And so it's like, so did Jesus take away the feast? No, actually, think about the prophetically, the Feast of Tabernacles is a prophetic holiday that celebrates the return of Jesus Christ. So why would he do away with it? You know, just Passover was he fulfilled, well, you could say it this way. 2 of the 3 feasts have been fulfilled prophetically. Passover, Jesus was crucified, and we celebrate it every year because now we're remembering what he did, right? Pentecost, that was the day that the Holy Spirit came. Feast of Tabernacles, yet future. And interestingly enough, the book of Revelation, when the end comes, Jesus returns on the Feast of Tabernacles, because how do I know that? It's grape harvest. Because when he comes back, it says he treads the winepress in his fury. So the grapes wouldn't be in the winepress unless it was grape harvest. So those feasts, and why am I drawing a connection here between heavenly bodies, holidays, and everything as far as having physical, practical, and spiritual applications to it, because they all come together in the book of Revelation like that. The Feast of Tabernacles is was not only a physical, natural harvest time and celebration, but it looks forward to the future time of the end.
Let's see. Ephraim says the elongated movement of the planet's revolution around the sun make it hard to follow any of the time keepings.
Say that one more. Read that one more time.
The elongated movement of the planet's revolution around the sun make it hard to follow any of the time keepings.
Okay, I'm not sure what they're getting at, but I'll just throw this in there. Now, I went back and I said that the prophetic times in Daniel and Revelation were centered around a 360-day year. Well, if you go back to the time of Noah, it appears that the time that he was on, the times that were involved with him being on the ark and everything, was based, at least the first 5 months, were based off of a 360-day year. When you go back and you do all those calculations, now the speculation is, and I'm not leaning one way or the other at this point. The speculation is that the calendar used to be totally in sync. The lunar, solar, and the solar calendar used to be totally in sync with one another, and you didn't have to add any other 13 months or anything. And that each year was exactly 360 days with 12 months of exactly 30 days. And that way there was no intercalary months or days being added, and it was just a perfect calendar. And then some say that perfect calendar got either thrown off at Noah's flood, or the time of, remember when the sun stood still over in the book of Joshua, the sun stood still. And the other time, and that was actually, so God did actually change this stuff in the sun and the moon and the stars, where he actually made it stand still. And the day the day was lengthened. I can't remember to how many hours. But there was another time where God brought back the sundial of Ahaz 15 degrees. Or was it 15? 10 or 15? I can't remember. I think it was 15 degrees. So speculation is when those things happen, that could be why we're scratching our head saying, why don't these calendars line up? Why is it so why do we have to add? It doesn't make sense. We got to add a 13th month, or we got to add a day, or whatever. If they were all in perfect harmony with one another, it would have been very easy. But the flip side of that is those little fractions that make it so that the calendars don't line up evenly every year do create larger cycles of time. And if you're measuring not just year by year by year and then having to count years, but now you want to know what is year 10,000 from the year 20 million, you can get what I'm going. If you're living in the eternity, these fractions could help you still keep track of time because they're all different. Everything ends up different. Whereas if everything was totally equal, it would be hard to tell the difference from one year to the next over long periods of time. So just food for thought, just throwing it all out there. And obviously there isn't any consensus on this topic. All we can do is know what works now, and it does work. You don't want your seasons out of line with your months. And what works is simply adding a month, a 13th month every so often, whether you're looking at the barley harvest or whether you're just going by the 19-year cycle.
Ephraim also says, I heard eventually using the Gregorian calendar, you have to deduct a day because the year is off by 25 seconds every year.
Yeah. There's smaller. Yeah, there's other variables. You start getting into the smaller things, and there's other variables. And that's that's the thing you find fascinating is nothing seems to work out perfectly, and it may be by perfect design. In my opinion, like I said, it may be by perfect design that way, so you have all these different cycles, and not one day is ever the same as the last. Not one day of last year is the same as this year. There's always something different in time and space. Or everything was perfectly lined up and God changed it because of sin or some other thing.
Keith Olson says, I thought Passover was 15 days after the spring equinox.
On the 14th day was when they made the Passover sacrifice. The blood of the lamb would go on the doorposts, like in Egypt. And then the days of unleavened bread began on the 15th. Is that correct? Yeah, I believe we just read through that chapter today. Sometimes I get lost in the details as well. So, but and it was 7 days long after that. So technically, Passover would be like 15 days long if you count the night, the Passover night. Well, not really, because it would start at night. Well, yeah, it would, because it'd be 14th. Yeah. So, yeah, when you start getting into that, it makes it harder when you're going from night to night. But then here's the other thing that people throw out. Why do biblical days start at the nighttime? It doesn't make sense, because a new day to me is when I see the sun come up. And I struggled with that for a long time. But if you go back to creation, which is the creation week, which is the model for all time in the future, the first day, there wasn't any light. The first day started with darkness, and then light came. And so I think that pattern reminds us of creation, that everything began in darkness, and then the Holy Spirit moved and light came. Anything else? Any other questions on there?
Ephraim says, he didn't die on the cross yet. All things were a shadow of him as an object. That's why he followed them. Father knows our hearts and our intentions because they're stuck in the law of works.
So when they celebrated the Passover, is what he's saying is that Jesus hadn't died yet? Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, that Passover was a foreshadow of what Jesus would do at the first Advent, just as the Feast of Tabernacles, like I mentioned earlier, is a foreshadow of what he's going to do at the second Advent. Instead of dying on the cross, instead of being the lamb slain, he's going to be the man that harvests the grapes by stomping on them when he returns.
Ephraim also says, yes, whether whatever total days consisted or a year, 360 or 364. Here, he purposefully messed it up in us to fulfill his will.
Yeah. All right. So he believes that that the time is purposely out of line. Either by design or by, like I said, it's either by design or because of sin. Anything else? Is that it? All right. Well, we want to thank everybody for joining us. We will see you next time. Until then, stay in his word every single day so that you can be a Christian overcomer. God bless.
Christian Overcomers is brought to you by the tithes and offerings of our listeners. If you would like to support our ministry, please go to ChristianOvercomers.com. God bless you, and thank you for your support.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on.